Hello and welcome to tutorial 2 from the XNA series. And what we're going to cover in this one is a brief overview in C#. We're going to do that for about 3 tutorials, and then we're going to go into XNA stuff. So right now we're just going to focus on C# for 3 tutorials and then go from there. So in this tutorial we're going to cover methods and variables. And I'm going to assume that you do not know any C#, so I'm going to cover everything about methods and variables for you. So let's first talk about variables. A variable is a place in memory that holds specific information. You need to initialize a variable before you can use it in order for the program to make the appropriate variable size and content. You can't use it without initializing it because your memory space isn't allocated to that specific variable. And you'll see why in the table I'll show you right here. These are the variable types, and of course there's a lot more than these. This is the size of those variable types, and this is what values it can hold. Double and long are about the longest size variables. There's others that have 8 bytes, but those are pretty long variables to use. Char and bool and a lot of other ones are 1 byte. Of course there's a variable type called byte, but I won't go into that. This is just the most common ones. And what happens when you create a variable, you tell it what type it is, like int for integer. It'll make the memory space, int has 4 bytes, so it'll make the memory space 4 bytes, and it will know what to expect as values. So that's why you need to initialize before you use it. Now here's variable usage. In short, we just say short variable name is equal to whatever. You can replace X with anything. I just left X in there because that's the most common. Long X is equal to whatever number, negative or positive. Int, same thing. Char variable is equal to single quote letter single quote. Remember to keep the single quotes when you use char. Bool variable is equal to either true or false. Remember that for booleans. Now float and double, this is pretty interesting. For float you say what, just like you do an integer, but it has a decimal place, so you can put decimal, but right before you do the semicolon, put an F there. Notice after the 793 there's an F there. That indicates that this number is a float. For double, it's the same thing, but put a capital D in there. There's another decimal place type called decimal. So for that, you just put a lowercase m for the decimal type. Now before we go into methods, let's go into the editor and make some variables. So right now I created a console application. If you want to know how to do that, go to File, New Project, and then you'll be brought a window, and one of those options is a console application. So select that, type whatever you want to name it, and you'll get this code right here. So now let's make a few variables and I'll print information out in the monitor. So let's make an int x is equal to 32. Remember the semicolon. Double y is equal to 4.55d. Remember the semicolon. Float z is equal to 4.32 f. So now let's write to the monitor. Don't worry too much about how to write stuff to the monitor because chances are you never will with XNA. X is equal to plus x dot 2. This isn't really necessary, but I'm used to it. Y is equal to plus y dot 2. Okay. Now we need to wait for the user to press a key. Again, you don't need to know these two lines because chances are you never will use a console on XNA. You might if you want to do debugging. So now press F5 and it'll build and run in the command prompt. And we're just printing out the information we have here. And it should have space between those two. Okay. X is equal to 32. Let's go back and check. Okay, X is equal to 32. That's right. Y is equal to 4.55. That's correct. Z is equal to 4.32. That's correct. And you can change this later on. It's not like once you initialize it, you can't change it. So maybe I want to say later on in the code x is equal to 5. I want to change the value. So now my output is now 5 for x, not 32. And let's say I want to take the double value of y and store it into x. But as we know, x is an integer and y is a double. So can I do this, or will I get an error? And I'll get an error. So if you want to store a double variable, or the contents of a double variable inside of a integer variable, or anything like that, you need to cast. And it says can't implicitly convert type double to int. An explicit conversion exists. Are you missing a cast? So for casting, before the variable or number, put a parenthesis and then your variable type you want to convert. So I want this double value to be an int. So what this will do is it'll convert y into an integer value and store it into x. When it converts, it will drop the decimal, so it'll only be 4. It'll drop 0.55. So we compile it and run it, and x is equal to 4. Same thing with float. It probably usually does, but just to be safe, z is equal to y. Yep. So you just do float to cast it. So that's it for variables. We'll cover more about those once we get into the coding. So now let's talk about methods. A method is a place in a program where actions are performed. Certain tasks can only be performed inside of a method. However, there are some tasks that can only be performed outside of a method, and we'll go in more on those later on. Now, I'll be using grammar templates throughout the series, and what those are is you can replace anything I show you here, like access modifier, return type, method name, parameters, and statements, to whatever you want. And between greater than and less than, or less than and greater than, and in green is optional. So you don't really need this, and you don't really need this. What's in blue is a C# keyword. And that C# keyword we'll cover in the next slide or two. And then method name, that's what you want to call that method. It can be anything you want. Bark, hi, fun, anything you want it to be. Printing. And then the parameters, we'll go over this next tutorial, and those are optional too. But the method name, return type, open parenthesis, closing parenthesis, open curly braces, closing curly braces, those are all required for the method. So let's talk about return types, or the access modifiers first. Note, there are a lot more modifiers than you see here, and we'll go more in depth on those when we talk about OOP. But I'm only going to be talking about these two because you have already seen these two already. This method has static, and it's implied that it's public. So let's just go over public and static for now, and we'll go over the rest of them later on. So public. Public sets this method, attribute, or class as a public access, meaning anything that wants access to it has access to it. Static sets this method or attribute as class level, meaning you cannot create an object because that attribute or method is class level, meaning it belongs to that class. As we see here, this main is set to static, and it's set to that class. So if we make an object out of this, you will not see main inside the object list, and we can show that to you now. This is all the inherited stuff I got from making an object of the class program. And as you can see, main is not in that list because it cannot be defined to an individual object. So now let's talk about return types. There are more return types than you see here, but these are just a basic. Any variable type that you can have or user-defined type can be a return type. So if you make a class that is a user-defined variable type, and that class or a user-defined variable type can be set as a return type. So we can have unlimited return types. You can have int, double, float, boolean, decimal, byte, string, program even, because I made a class called program. That can be a return type too. So these are just the very basic and most common return types. So the very first one is void, and you've seen that before right here. Public static void main. This means that it returns nothing, and is used mainly for variable assignments or printing stuff to the monitor, or for main method. A main method is always void because we're not really returning anything and we're just running the code. int, double, and float. All these are similar, so I'll cover all these at once. These return a variable value. So int returns the integer value, double returns the double value, and float returns a float value. Now, calling a method. And there are more ways to call a method, and we'll go more in depth on them when we talk about OOP. But for now, all you need to know is how to call it with the non-returning method, and you just call it by its method name, parentheses, semicolon. So let's go and make a method. Leave these. Okay. So the method we're going to make, and you can call it and it will have you make it. So if you want to finish up your main method before you focusing on other methods, you can. Let's say I want to make a method called print, and I want to call it right now. You see the little purple rectangle under there, and once you hover over it, you'll get this pop-up window, and you click that, and it's a generate method stub for print in your program, and that will be at the very bottom. And usually when it does that, it will do private because you're inside of a class, and it won't need that. But you can change that to public. And we're just going to print out the information. And let's get rid of these variables because we're just going to cover printing right now. Okay, so we're just going to print out hello world inside of a different method. Hello world. So now, when we run the program, it'll print hello world. Now let's take a quick time to look at the debugger. Now this program works, and in some cases, if you have a big project, most of the time it will not work. That's just because of programming. Usually it won't work. It'll take a few tries before it will work. But this is a useful learning tool and useful for watching how your program works. So if a program you find works and you want to know how it works, you can use the debugger to do that. So this program works, we've seen it work, and we want to know how it works. So the first line in main is print. So we'll go over to the very left of that, the little gray rectangle right here, and click that line. Then we have a red circle, and the line is red. So when we press F5 to build it, it will bring up the command prompt, but it'll pause the program and we are now debugging. Now our line is in yellow. So the very above program.cs you have load of debugging options. You can play, pause, stop, restart, show next statement, step into, step over, and step out. The most commonly used is step into to follow the program step by step. Step over will not go inside of a method, so we just do step over, and now we're going to the next line inside of this method. So let's press stop and press F5 again. Now let's do step over, or step into. We'll go inside of that method, and now we're actually walking through the program step by step. So when the program first starts up, it goes to the print method. And then the next step is going to that method. Then the next step is going to the console.writeLine. Then the next step is actually printing that out to the monitor. It did that. Then the next step is quitting that method and returning to the previous one I called it, which is main. Then the next step is waiting for the user to press a key. And we step into again, and now we have to press a key, and now we're debugging again, and then we step into again, and then the program quits. So if you want to learn how any program works, just do that and you step into. And step over just will not go in the actual method calls and stuff like that. Step out will, if you're inside of a loop that'll take like 500 loops, step out will exit that loop. If we go back and debug it again, this play or continue will continue the program, or continue it until the next line break. So we'll have two line breaks. I know they're right next to each other, but actually in the program it's not, because it's going to call that method, then go here. So it's going to do this before going there. So let's press F5, and now we're on the first line break. So when we hit the continue, it went to the next line break. And if we go back to the command prompt, it printed out the hello world. So that's what you can do with the debug, and you can do this when you want to check for errors in your program too. We'll go more in depth on that when we go into the XNA. So that's it for this tutorial. The next tutorial we're going to talk about parameters and arguments, method overloading, loops, and decision. Chances are we won't get into decision, but just to be safe and just in case we might, it's right there. So hope to see you next time.